Hello and welcome. In today's lecture, we're going to be talking about the endocrine system and our endocrine responses as it relates to exercise. Okay, so when we think about the endocrine system and what we're trying to achieve here, the endocrine system has several functions. Number one, it's going to help to maintain homeostasis and coordinated communication within the body. So again, think of this as kind of like a slower version of the nervous system. So the nervous system is going to allow communication to occur really quickly. However, within the endocrine system, these processes are going to be a little more delayed. The endocrine system will also play an important role in the human body's effect for change and support for exercise demands and also in recovery. So we'll talk about how that system can kind of be upregulated and how we might manipulate this based on the needs of the individual. And then also we can understand how the principles of periodization can be applied to understanding how to best upregulate the system in relation to improvement of our training stimuli. So here you can see the different endocrine glands. One thing that's unique about the endocrine system is that these glands are located all over the body. So they're not just regionally specific, but we've kind of got them all over the place. So we have the pituitary gland, which is located kind of at the base of the brain there. We have the parathyroid gland, which is going to sit on top of the thyroid gland, which is kind of found in the throat area. There you can see the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland is the bigger portion. Parathyroid gland is like these little dots that kind of sit on top of the thyroid gland. You have the thymus, which is going to sit directly on top of the heart. We have the adrenal glands, which we'll talk about in a great amount of detail, that are going to sit on top of the kidneys. You have the pancreas, which is also found kind of within those vital organs of the digestive area. We have ovaries for our females and testes, which will be found in males, and those will serve as important reproductive organs for us as it relates to hormone function for each of those reproductive systems, but also can be pretty influential when you think about their role as it relates to exercise. So let's take a look. So here you can see the pituitary gland, and again, this is kind of located underneath or on that bottom portion of the brain, and it's going to actually secrete 9 different hormones. So we have 2 different like lobes. You can see here we have an anterior lobe and a posterior lobe, and the anterior lobe is going to secrete most of the hormones. The anterior lobe is going to create GH, TSH, ACTH, MSH, FSH, LH, and PRL, which we'll get into on the next slide. But again, that is contributing to 7 different hormones. And then the posterior lobe is going to secrete something known as vasopressin or ADH, and also oxytocin. Okay, so that posterior section here, the light pink, only contributes a little bit in comparison to what we see coming from that anterior lobe. So we think about the anterior lobe, kind of what's going on. As I said, there are several different hormones that are going to be involved. And here you can see each of those hormones that are secreted, and we will fill in on the right side here the target organ and the target effects of each of these. Okay, so growth hormone is a really important hormone when we think about exercise status. And growth hormone is going to serve in its role for promoting growth. Now, certainly this is going to be important in adolescence and as we grow, as an individual till we reach adulthood. However, during adulthood, it is also important in terms of allowing us to have growth and maintenance for the liver, muscle, bone, cartilage, and some of those various locations. Okay. TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone, its goal is to target the thyroid gland, and it's going to cause the release of thyroid hormone from that thyroid gland. So TSH stimulates the thyroid gland, and that thyroid gland is then going to release thyroid hormone, which is really important for metabolism. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, is going to stimulate the adrenal cortex, and this is going to cause the release of androgens and glucocorticoids, which is going to help the body to deal with like stressful situations. So we would have high amounts of ACTH in times of high stress. And basically, it's going to help us to save the carbs that we have for our brain in terms of metabolism, and forces all other areas of the body to rely on like fats and amino acids for fuel. And again, the interesting thing about ACTH and the interesting thing about stress is our body or our brains can't differentiate between a physical stress and more of a psychological or mental stress. So our response from an endocrine perspective is the same, whether you're stressed about getting everything done on your to-do list, or your stress is I'm doing a 3-hour bike ride. Okay, so again, your body can't necessarily differentiate. So from an endocrine perspective, it will look the same. Okay. FSH is a hormone that's really important for the endocrine system, and this is going to have its target organ be either the testes for our males, and in the males, this will help to stimulate sperm production, or the ovaries for our females. And FSH will stimulate the maturation of a follicle, which will eventually lead to ovulation. Okay, so basically women have all these eggs inside the ovaries, and when I release FSH, it's going to cause one of those eggs to become more mature, and then we're going to release that egg for ovulation. So again, for females, this FSH hormone is going to be pretty cyclical, so it'll spike once a month. For men, it's more of like, think of it as like supply and demand essentially. So women are born with all the eggs that they're going to have. And so we're not producing new eggs. We're just going to basically select one each month or each time we ovulate, which ideally is once a month, to be released. But for men, like I said, it's more supply demand. So sperm or not, like there's not a lot of sperm stored. Like we can produce more sperm all the time. So again, the more I use sperm, right, the greater that feedback loop will be. Okay, so again, it's more supply and demand for men. For women, like I said, it's more cyclical. Okay. Luteinizing hormone is also important for those reproductive processes. So luteinizing hormone for females will stimulate ovulation. Okay, so again, follicle stimulating hormone got the egg ready to be released, and then luteinizing hormone is going to cause us to release that egg for ovulation. And for men, luteinizing hormone is going to promote testosterone production and thus support the vitality of the sperm, essentially. Prolactin is a hormone that I think only women produce. I'm not sure why men would produce this because it doesn't have any function in men, but prolactin is going to promote lactation in female breast tissue after the baby is born. So once baby is born, prolactin is going to work on a supply and demand type of situation in order for us to promote or produce enough breast milk to supply the need. Okay, so again, it's really supply and demand, and it's going to work on kind of this negative feedback loop in order for us to maintain what we're utilizing. Okay, so here you can see a hormone known as ADH, which is known as antidiuretic hormone. And antidiuretic hormone is going to come from that posterior pituitary, and its job is to help us to retain fluid. So if it's an antidiuretic, a diuretic's job, like coffee or beer, is going to make us pee more, to make us lose that fluid. An antidiuretic is going to help us to retain fluid. Okay, so here you can see the relationship between ADH and percentage of VO2 max. So essentially, the harder I work, or the more exercise I do, the higher that ADH. And again, this is going to be a protective mechanism that's going to help us to hold on to as much fluids as we can. We don't want to waste time going pee when we're exercising. We want to hold on to that fluid so that we can use it to help us dissipate heat through sweat. So that's kind of the reason why this will see these ADH levels increase during exercise, kind of based on what its job is, what its goal is. The next hormone to take a look at is known as the thyroid, or I'm sorry, the next endocrine gland, I should say, is the thyroid gland. And that's going to produce two different hormones. We have thyroid hormone and calcitonin. Thyroid hormone was stimulated by TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone, which we said came from the anterior pituitary, and its job was to allow us to increase metabolic rate. Okay, so thyroid hormone has a kind of an all-encompassing effect on the body. Its main job, as we said, was to increase metabolic rate. People can have high levels of thyroid hormone, which would be hyperthyroidism, and those type of people would be more likely to be thin. They're going to be hot all the time. They're going to have a lot of energy. They're going to have a high metabolism, so they can kind of eat what they want with no issues that way. Hypothyroidism is when I have low thyroid hormone, and again, I'm going to feel sluggish. I'm going to feel cold. It's going to be easy to gain weight in that situation. So those are some examples of kind of thyroid. Calcitonin is a hormone that's going to be released when blood calcium levels are too high. And so this is only mostly seen, like this would be pretty rare in adults. It's mostly just active in children when they have substantial amount of growth in their bones. And like I said, much less of an effect in adults. So when blood calcium levels become too high, calcium is going to be excreted by the kidneys. So like we'll pee it out. And osteoclasts slow down their release of calcium into the blood. So osteoclasts are like these cells within the bone that are going to break down bone. And so essentially, like, we're going to break down less bone and we're going to pee out some calcium if calcitonin is activated, telling us that we have too much calcium within the bones. Again, not a huge concern, particularly not in athletes. As it relates to thyroid hormone and its effect in athletics, this would be a really important thing to know. So if somebody was hypothyroidism in particular, this could explain maybe a lack of performance or a decline in performance. Again, it wouldn't be super common to kind of develop this during athletics, but it's not unheard of to develop either. So that would be a factor that would make a substantial difference in terms of athletic performance. Okay. Moving forward to the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands have two sections. There's the adrenal cortex and there's the adrenal medulla. The cortex is going to be on the outside and the medulla is on the inside of that adrenal gland. Okay, so the cortex kind of surrounds the medulla. And let's start by talking about the cortex. As we said, the cortex is on the outside and it's going to produce something known as corticosteroids. And these two corticosteroids are known as aldosterone and cortisol. Okay? Aldosterone's job is to help us to conserve water via retention of sodium in the kidneys. Okay, so when we think about sodium and how sodium works and how sodium moves, sodium is a water-loving molecule. Okay, so when we have salt, water wants to go with salt. This is why when you eat salty food, you're also thirsty, because that salt and water want to move together. Okay, and so essentially by holding on to salt, my water within my body will want to stay with that salt. Okay, so aldosterone is going to work hand in hand with ADH, or antidiuretic hormone, in order for us to maintain or hold on to as much fluid as we can. As you might imagine, aldosterone levels are going to climb during exercise. They're also going to climb in hot conditions as well. And the idea there is we want to try to retain all the fluids that we possibly can. Cortisol is a stress hormone, and cortisol's job is to help the body cope with stress by kind of impacting metabolism a little bit. So it's going to help us to stabilize our blood glucose levels and inhibit levels of inflammation. Okay, so again, we're going to see spikes in cortisol after we do something hard, something stressful, and cortisol spikes are good. Constantly high cortisol levels is going to be bad. Constantly high cortisol levels is a sign of overtraining and can cause us to be at greater risk for a lot of other issues and conditions. And then as we move to the adrenal medulla, we said the medulla was going to be that inner portion of the adrenal gland, and that's going to release two awesome hormones that are epinephrine and norepinephrine. And the surge in adrenaline that we feel in fight or flight situations is caused by this flooding of epinephrine and norepinephrine, right? So again, if you were to, a lion walks into my office right now, my heart would start racing, I would start sweating, my eyes would dilate, lots of things would change. And again, the reasons for that feeling of adrenaline. It has everything to do with our perception of fear and the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine. So interestingly, a lot of that, like I said, has to do with perception, right? So again, when you perceive something to be stressful, that's when we're going to release these hormones. Now, the response or this release of these hormones is going to be the same in everyone. However, what we perceive as scary or what we perceive as threatening depends on the person, right? It depends on your own perception. The other thing that's interesting to think about when we think about the difference between like elite athletes and maybe like our high school or kind of lower level athletes that don't handle stress very well is your perception of how you feel when you release these. Okay. So as I mentioned, you're going to increase your heart rate. You're going to be sweating. You're going to feel maybe jittery. You're going to feel a little nauseous maybe if we release these things. Okay. Elite athletes view those things as good. Elite athletes say, I'm excited, I'm ready to go, my body's ready to go. Okay, so their perception is these feelings of stress, these feelings of nervousness are good things. That shows that you care, that shows that we're ready to roll. Okay, in our maybe more novice athletes, they don't like those feelings because there's uncertainty, they don't have the confidence, they perceive their nerves as a hindrance, and so therefore they are. So we think about this like self-fulfilling prophecy. I know I'm going down a small tangent here. That can become a reality when we think about our perception of what's happening with us physically and how that impacts our decision making, our attitude, and our outlook in a game situation. Okay, so here you can see aldosterone. Again, we said aldosterone was a hormone that was going to be impacted or released from the adrenal cortex. And here you can see its relationship as we look at exercise intensity. So exercise intensity increases, we see aldosterone also increase. Renin and angiotensin are kind of like precursors. They're like a cascade of events that allow us to release aldosterone. We just cut to the chase and skipped through those two in this conversation. But essentially what we're seeing here is the harder I work, the more aldosterone I release. So therefore, the greater the likelihood that I can retain that salt and therefore retain fluids as well. And I can save those things as I continue to do this prolonged exercise bout so that I can use those fluids for sweat and helping me to kind of stay cool. So a couple other things to note about epinephrine and norepinephrine. Again, these are fast acting hormones. So again, we can go from totally relaxed to holy shit, it's time to do this, right? So again, our nerves can really come on fast in terms of the release of these two things. Okay. And what else are they doing besides just making us feel jittery? They're going to help us to maintain blood glucose levels. So again, they're going to dump some sugars into the blood. By mobilizing our storage version. So we're going to take like glycogen out of storage and we're going to dump those sugars into the blood so that we have an increase in blood sugar. So we're ready to go. We're going to increase liver glucose mobilization. So again, if there's some sugars in the liver that are ready to go, we can get those kind of available so that we can use those for a fuel, particularly if we need that for like high intensity exercise. We can also increase free fatty acid mobilization. So again, by having more fats available, I'm ready to continue to do prolonged exercise. And again, if you think about these in terms of stress and survival, this whole idea of like fight or flight, again, if a tiger walks into my office, I really have a couple options. Number one, I can fight the tiger. Okay, so I'm going to need to be all in terms of intensity. I need to be at the highest intensity I possibly can if I need to punch this tiger or wrestle him or whatever it is that I'm going to do in order to survive. My other option is run or flight. Okay. And so if I run away from the tiger, not only do I need to be fast and powerful in order to get away, I might also have to run for like a really long time. We don't know. And so we need to have these fats available to allow us to continue to run for a prolonged period of time to get away from our enemy, whoever that may be. Okay. how does this look in terms of its interference with glucose uptake? Again, we will see that there is a little bit of it's not a perfect system. So again, fats versus carbs. Again, some of us are going to be better suited to have that high intensity, maybe short duration, and some of us are going to be better suited for running away and running really far away in order to get away from our enemy here. So when we think about muscle glycogen utilization, and again, this is like the amount of sugars that we're using for fuel, glycogenolysis is related to exercise intensity. Okay, so the higher the intensity, the more glucose I need in order for this process to occur. Again, we believe that the epinephrine that we release from the adrenal gland is going to be a strong stimulator of glycogenolysis. And glycogenolysis is basically like the production of new glucose molecules. So if we take sugars out of storage and create new glucose molecules, that's what glycogenolysis is. And so by having a lot of epinephrine, that stress hormone, that's going to cause us to get a bunch of sugar out of storage. So when we think about depletion of glycogen during exercise, here we can kind of take a look at what's happening as it relates to how long we're going and what percentage of glycogen we're depleting. Okay, so glycogen depletion here, if I do like a nice light intensity exercise for 2 hours, I'm going to deplete about 30%. Okay, and again, probably the reason for that is with that light intensity, we're relying more on fats. Again, here you can see maybe more of like a moderate intensity. I can go 2 hours and deplete about 60% of that at a moderate intensity. If I do a high intensity or higher intensity, we're going to deplete about 75% of that glycogen within 90 minutes. So again, think of like if you're a soccer coach, for example, if I have a match or a practice that's 90 minutes long or more, I'm going to deplete about 75% of glycogen if it's at a high intensity. Okay. And then here you can kind of see these other options too in terms of percentage of VO2 max and how much glycogen we're depleting there. In comparison to exercise intensity, we can also take a look here at the epinephrine levels. Okay, so high intensity exercise, you can see, look how high those epinephrine levels are. Low intensity, so 40 to 50% VO2 max, that'd be like a low intensity, is only increasing those epinephrine levels just slightly. Okay, so again, the harder I work, the greater the epinephrine response. When we think about the pancreas, which you can see here, kind of this yellow section, there are two important hormones to kind of mention as it relates to metabolism. So we have insulin and glucagon, and they are going to work in opposition. These guys are opposites. Okay? They are also both fast acting. And insulin's job is to help us to control blood sugar. So is glucagon's job, but basically insulin is going to be released when we put a bunch of sugars into our blood. So for example, every time you eat, you're going to have insulin release, and that's going to help us to get those sugars from the bloodstream into storage or wherever we need them to be used. Okay, so they're going to help us uptake and store sugars and free fatty acids. However, during exercise, we see a decrease in insulin. And the reason for that is because during exercise, we don't want to be storing sugar. We want it to be ready so that we can use it. So we're going to kind of shut off insulin while we are doing that exercise. We'll also see a decreased insulin response following training as well. So again, that's going to allow us to have those sugars readily available instead of storing them. Okay, so as I mentioned, glucagon is going to work in opposition. So glucagon's job is to get sugars out of storage and put them into the blood so that we're ready to utilize them as a fuel. So it's job mobilization. So getting things out of storage, getting them ready for use. And these concentrations are going to increase during exercise. Like the longer we go or the higher the intensity we have, the more I need to get out of storage in order for us to be ready to use those as a fuel. We'll also see a decreased response following training as well with glucagon. Again, when we think about how these hormones are going to work together, you either have one on or the other on kind of at all times. It's like they'll never be released together because they work in opposition. So it's like you either have one going or the other one going. But they're also going to be influenced by those catecholamines that we talked about. The next gland that we're going to take a look at is something called the pineal gland. And you can see the pineal gland here, kind of located internally within the brain. And the pineal gland is going to release something known as melatonin. And melatonin's job is to help us to regulate circadian rhythms. So again, it's going to help us to kind of monitor our sleep-wake cycles. And so one thing to note here, I guess a common little misstep is melanin versus melatonin. Okay, melanin is important for our skin color, and that's going to determine how dark our skin is or how light our skin is, versus melatonin, and melatonin is what we're talking about here. Melatonin helps us to regulate these sleep-wake cycles. Okay, and essentially, like, how is this important in athletics, or how is this important in sport? It's really important when we think about our quality of sleep. So the pineal gland, the melatonin that we release is going to be cyclical, right? So on a kind of like a 24-hour schedule, it's going to help us to feel drowsy at night, and we'll kind of taper off that melatonin in the morning, which is what allows us to stay aroused or awake when we wake up in the morning, right? And again, these should be pretty natural, but unfortunately, if you're working with high school or college athletes, really any athletes, it's very, very easy for us to manipulate this and kind of go against this cyclical process. And so therefore we're going to have issues with sleep and sleep quality. Again, a lot of the things that we choose to do will influence our release of melatonin as well. So blue light and screens before we go to bed is a good way for us to stimulate the brain and prevent us from releasing melatonin, which prevents us from getting right to sleep and can prevent us from getting the highest quality of sleep that we can possibly have. As you probably already know, sleep is one of the most important elements when we think about recovery for our athletes. So promoting a good sleep schedule is really important, but also promoting how can I get the greatest quality out of that sleep as well. So thinking about the things that we're doing as it relates to caffeine and blue light and stimulation at night will be big influencers in terms of how much of this we're releasing, how regularly. The other thing is when we have athletes that are not sleeping consistently. So maybe I'm staying up late because I need to study for an exam, and then I sleep in the next morning, and that kind of throws things off. Or like for college athletes, like I have a 6 a.m. lift or whatever, but then I'm going to be out with my friends at the bar that night or whatever it might be, right? We do a really good job of messing up our sleep cycles, particularly for high school and college age athletes. The other thing to note is, which is kind of interesting when we think about sleep quality, is in adolescence, they are releasing a lot more melatonin, which is why like kids want to sleep in. But our sports schedules and school schedules don't necessarily allow that to allow them to follow their circadian rhythms. So again, that certainly affects our sleep quality, and it certainly affects our recovery rates for these athletes as well. Okay. Moving on to the gonads, or these reproductive organs. We have the testes and ovaries seen here. So we'll start up here with the gals. So you've got the ovaries. Here you've got 2 ovaries. You have a fallopian tube exiting from each of the ovaries. When a female ovulates, they're going to release an egg into the fallopian tube, and that egg is going to travel down to the uterus, which is this section. If that egg becomes fertilized, it will implant on the uterine wall, and baby will grow in this particular area. Okay. If baby decides to exit, or the female does not become pregnant, we're going to have that egg exit in the same manner. They will both exit through the cervix and out into the external world. Okay. For the men, you can see here the different components. We've got the testes here in the middle. We have the epididymis, which sits on top of the testes. And then we have what's called the vas deferens here, which is a tube that's going to carry the sperm from here through the penis to be released into the external world. Okay. Other things to note here as it relates to these hormones, like I said, testosterone will be coming from the male reproductive organs. And this is going to help us to maintain the reproductive organs, also produces secondary sex characteristics of our males, and promotes the formation of sperm. Women actually also have testosterone, but it's much smaller level in comparison to men. The athletic benefit of having testosterone has to do with our ability or potential to build muscle mass. So more testosterone generally means a greater amount of muscle mass gain in terms of potential. You still have to do the work to get that muscle bigger. Also, testosterone will help us to promote red blood cell production within the blood. And so therefore, the more red blood cells I have, the more oxygen I can carry, the more aerobic work I can do. And again, we believe that it is mostly testosterone being the indicator of why men are better from an athletic perspective than women. Just simply from that physiological perspective, it has to do with muscle mass production and also red blood cell production as it relates to aerobic work. Okay, estrogen and progesterone, these are our two female sex characteristics or sex hormones. Males also have these two hormones, but a much smaller extent in comparison to the females. Estrogen's job is to help maintain reproductive organs and secondary sex characteristics for our females. So the formation and maintenance of breast tissue and like fat stored in the hips and thigh area, higher voice, and some of those more, like softer features for females. Progesterone's job is to signal the uterus to prepare for pregnancy. So progesterone is going to help us to build up what's called the endometrial lining inside the uterus. And it's like creates this vasculature where there's a bunch of like sugar available so that like if an egg implants in this area, it's a welcoming environment where that egg can survive and have fuel right away. From an athletic perspective, unfortunately for women, there isn't a lot of positives to having these two hormones. I would say the really only positive that we see is with estrogen. Estrogen actually helps us to promote the storage of calcium. So for women, in order for us to like maintain a normal menstrual cycle, that's really important because we need that estrogen release in order for us to store calcium and keep our bones healthy and safe. So that's just one thing to kind of think about. And I think, interestingly, like if you're working with adolescent athletes that are going through puberty and things like that, it's really important to kind of normalize these changes that both our young men and young women are going to go through. So for men, again, I'm a boys high school coach. So this is I guess makes sport easier for men. When men go through adolescence or go through puberty, they get testosterone. They get to build more muscle mass. They produce more red blood cells. So they get stronger and they gain aerobic fitness or aerobic capacity, right? So for men, it's easy for them to continue to improve. And therefore, it's easy for them to hold on to their love of the sport. Who thought I was going to get into these psychological elements in the middle of an endocrine lecture? You just never know what you get with me. For women, it's a much different story, right? For women, when women go through puberty and they start experiencing the release of these hormones, they get hips, they get boobs, they gain weight, they get their period, which is also very traumatic and something, kind of can be, I don't want to say shameful, but it's a issue, right? So those are the challenges that our young ladies see. And again, as you gain weight, they've got to ride this performance wave, right? If you have a girl that's gaining, 15 pounds as she's becoming a woman, right? that can have huge implications on her athletic success. And again, we see women dropping out of sport 3 times faster or threefolds more so than men do. So this is really problematic, and it can be very, very um, discouraging for young ladies to kind of go through this. So my point here is that we've got to really be sensitive to this, and also give them some encouragement and help them to know, like, there's light at the end of the tunnel here. Even though we're going to kind of maybe see a performance dip, that's okay. You're going to get through it, and focusing kind of on the love of the sport, even if their times and their performances aren't necessarily linear like what we see with men. And so, the other thing that becomes difficult, particularly for women, although this is true for men as well, is like, how much does this affect you? How much does it affect your performance? Some of them it won't affect at all. Some of them it affects in a huge extent. So there's so much variance there too. I think it's really, really important that we normalize having these conversations, and we normalize just supporting them and helping them to kind of have different goals, based on, how this might impact their athletic performance. Thank you for attending my TED Talk. So when we think about muscle as a target for hormone interactions, what's going on here, right? So again, muscle remodeling involves disruptive damage to muscle fibers and inflammatory response, degradation of damaged proteins, hormonal and other signal interactions, and ultimately the synthesis of new proteins and their incorporation in new or existing sarcomeres. What the hell did I just say? Basically, what I'm saying is, like, when your muscles are broken down, like when you lift hard or you do a hard workout, there is a lot going on from a hormonal perspective to help us recover. Okay, so we have what's known as these anabolic hormones that are going to help us to contribute to various aspects in this process. Okay, so thyroid hormone is going to help us with overall metabolic rate, and it's also going to help us to block catabolic hormones. The catabolic hormones are hormones that are going to break down. Okay, so once we've done that breakdown, now we want to focus on how do I build things back up. So when we think about heavy resistance training, and how this affects our hormones, so long-term heavy resistance training causes substantial change in endocrine system and endocrine function. And I think probably one theme that you're going to continue to see throughout this class, when we think about athletics and we think about chronic change, is consistency is probably one of the most important things that we need in order to establish these improvements within any system, right? It's not enough to just do 1 week of hard lifting. It's not enough to do 1 week of consistent flexibility, right? We've got to be more consistent. We have to put in the time, and we have to wait it out in terms of these long-term months and years in order for us to truly see a substantial change within the system. Okay, so I would argue that consistent training for our athletes is one of the most important elements to their potential success. Okay, and that is true when we think about muscles and the endocrine system. So acute hormonal secretions provide us with information about the amount and type of stress, number one. Number two, the metabolic needs of the exercise, right? So do I need 300 calories? Do I need 600 calories? Do I need carbs? Do I need fats? What am I going to be using? And then also, what metabolic changes need to be made? Okay. Do I need to get more sugar out of storage? Do I need to get more fats out of storage? What's going on there? And how can I best serve this individual? And the more I do, the more I know, right? The better you become at this. Okay. So again, the type of exercise protocol activated will determine the extent to which these systems can become involved. We can also have what's called an anticipatory response. So just by thinking about, I'm going to go do this hard workout, we can actually start stimulating some of these hormonal changes just by that cognitive action, which is kind of nuts to think about. So when we think about heavy resistance exercise, again, this is going to be the greatest stimuli for us from an endocrine perspective. And so during heavy resistance exercise, large force production can cause alterations in our ability to import nutrients. And so due to these sensitivities, there's a number of hormone receptors in those muscle cells. And the idea here is that with this chronic resistance training, we're able to kind of upregulate those particular receptors, which will allow us to improve our tissue remodeling and repair, and allow us to continue to improve the quality and efficiency of that particular muscle. So when we think about these mechanisms, again, the sensitivity of a cell to a particular hormone may be altered in several ways. So number one, if a muscle cell has already reached its maximal size with long-term training. So again, we think about the ability for a cell to kind of max out on hypertrophy or max out on in terms of how big we can get it, then it may not be as sensitive to hormonal signals to stimulate further protein growth. Okay, so again, we do know that there is kind of that upper limit in terms of what is the kind of the maximal muscle size that we can achieve. And genetic predisposition will most likely determine when this occurs, right? So again, we kind of all have a different ceiling in terms of potential. And again, that's true in athletics in general. And that's going to be genetically predetermined. Receptors can also be desensitized when resting hormonal levels are chronically elevated due to disease or drug use. So again, we can have these mechanisms or modifications to the cells kind of based on other lifestyle factors. Okay, so highly trained people, again, are people that are already kind of close to that ceiling, are going to have a harder time improving to a greater extent, right? So again, an untrained person, it's much easier for them to see kind of a linear improvement. Once you're already close to that ceiling, it's much more difficult for us to continue to see those improvements. So we think about hormonal changes in the peripheral blood. Hormone responses are tightly linked to the characteristics of that exercise protocol. So again, when we think about being purposeful about what we're doing in the weight room, the endocrine system is a perfect example of a system that has to be targeted specifically in order for us to see these improvements. It's not just going to happen by accident. Okay, so we can learn a lot about the physical stress of a workout by monitoring the biomarkers in the blood. Okay, so we're able to measure blood concentrations of hormones, but this is just one piece of the puzzle. So it doesn't tell us about the receptors or the action of the hormone. Does a decrease in blood hormone concentration indicate an increase in hormonal uptake at the cellular level? Potentially. So there's a lot going on here. Certainly we could measure this, but like I said, when we think about the grand scheme of things in terms of helping our athletes to continue to improve, this is only one piece of the puzzle. For those athletes that are interested in gaining strength, gaining power, gaining muscle size, this isn't a very important piece. However, it is important to note that this is only one element when we think about the physiology of sport. So what about adaptations? So again, when we do things chronically, we do things consistently over time, we will see adaptations in all the systems of the body, including the endocrine system. So when you train skeletal muscle, you're also training the endocrine system, again, based on the demands of that exercise bout. So basically, in order for us to have these positive adaptations, we need to activate large motor units, so large muscle mass, and increase. This will cause a substantial amount of damage to that muscle itself, and therefore that will allow us the greatest endocrine response or our greatest hormonal response, and that will allow us to continue to improve at the greatest possible rate. So what are some of the possible adaptations that we might see within the endocrine system? The amount and synthesis and storage of hormones, time needed for clearance of hormones in the liver, how much blood to the tissue fluid shift occurs with exercise stress, how many receptors are in the tissue, and the degree of interaction with the cell nucleus. Okay, so again, essentially what we're saying is these different elements, these different pieces of the story will determine in at least some part, at least a proportion of this, will help us to determine how much protein is synthesized or how much protein are we making within the muscle cell. And again, the amount of protein that we have within that muscle cell is going to be very, very indicative of our potential strength, of our potential power, of our potential performance. So we have three primary anabolic hormones. We have testosterone, growth hormone, and another hormone known as insulin-like growth factor. And let's take a look at what each of these do and maybe how we can modify or stimulate changes in each. So testosterone is one of the most important factors when we think about strength production, and again, being able to have an adaptation within the endocrine system. So as we mentioned earlier in this lecture, testosterone is considered a male sex hormone. However, like I said, we find this in both men and women. Women are going to have this hormone to a lower extent. But essentially, like, what's going on here? Testosterone is going to promote growth hormone release. And again, we said growth hormone is going to help us to increase the size or quality of the muscle or of those muscle fibers. Okay. How do we stimulate this? Heavy resistance training using 1 to 2 reps may cause an increase in testosterone receptors. Okay. So again, these have to be very, very high intensity in order for us to kind of maximize our potential here. We can have increases in peripheral testosterone levels. Again, we'll find this in men following high intensity work. And interestingly, this can be both endurance exercise and resistance exercise. Okay, so we are seeing spikes in testosterone levels when we do any type of high intensity workout. However, we do know that testosterone concentrations have some diurnal variation. So that means like it's going to change throughout the one day. And we'll take a look at when we see those spikes in testosterone levels. And again, that isn't really that, I guess that's not really that important in the grand scheme of things. Just know that it is cyclical, like it's not going to be the same straight across the board throughout one particular day. However, the thing I want to focus on here is testosterone helps us to release growth hormone, which is going to help us to grow and repair. And when we do intense exercise, we're releasing testosterone as a result of that. And therefore, we're able to increase growth or increase recovery following that. So more testosterone is good both in endurance and resistance training. Okay. So again, like I said, testosterone is going to be released in kind of a diurnal fashion. So that means that it's going to cycle through in any given day. Here you can see diurnal variation of testosterone. It really spikes early in the morning. So I guess this is showing 0 would be like midnight. 6 is like 6 a.m. and then 24 is like the end of your day, midnight the next day, right? And notice that it does, your testosterone does peak highest in the early morning and then drops progressively throughout the day. So the question here is, does this affect when you should strength train, right? A lot of athletes or a lot of coaches want to know, like, okay, well, if testosterone peaks early in the morning, should I strength train early in the morning? And it turns out that the time of strength training doesn't affect these total testosterone concentrations, okay? Or have an effect on absolute strength potential or strength gain or anything else like that. So at the end of the day, we want our athletes to strength train when they can fit it in. When can they get the best workout possible, right? Some people are morning people, and so that works great. Others are going to be better off to work out at night. And again, so when we think about sleep quality, that's another important key when we think about having these adaptations. So we want our athletes to get good sleep. And number 2, it doesn't really matter when we strength train in terms of having these responses. So think of this response as kind of more holistic, right? So even if I strength train at night, it's still going to have effect on that testosterone level like the next morning, right? So again, we're still seeing a nice response no matter when in the day you fit in your workout. Okay, testosterone responses in women. Like I said, women do have testosterone. However, we have a lot less in comparison to men. So they have 15 to 20 times lower testosterone levels than men. However, women would also benefit from seeing increases in testosterone as it relates to that cascade of events where we're going to see an increase in growth hormone and therefore an increase in recovery, repair, and building in the muscles. Okay, so small but significant increases in testosterone can occur in women with resistance training, kind of at those high loads. So you're looking at a kind of a hypertrophy set here where we've got 6 sets, 10 squats, got to be a high intensity in order for this to occur. Some studies have been unable to demonstrate changes in testosterone levels with training. Okay. However, we do know that there is an upregulation of testosterone. So what that means is even if I'm only releasing the same amount, I get more bang for my buck the more elite I am or the more trained I am as a female. Okay, testosterone levels can vary substantially between individuals. So there is a huge diversity of levels that are considered normal within the female population. Okay, so again, generally speaking, and again, this is getting into a little bit of ethics and things like that. Generally speaking, elite level female athletes are going to be higher in testosterone just naturally in comparison to non-elite athletes. Again, is that a genetic component? Absolutely. And then you talk about like what's too much for a female. I'm going down a rabbit hole now, but thinking about that, it is interesting to think about our genetic potential and kind of what's going on from a biological perspective that sets this person up for success. And like I said, an elite female athlete is going to naturally have higher testosterone levels than their non-elite counterparts. Okay, so when you think about training adaptations related to testosterone, not much is understood about chronic responses of testosterone related to resistance training. However, we do know that there is an increase in exercise-induced testosterone concentrations due to a functional capacity improvement. Okay, so again, we do know that testosterone is in the mix when we think about adaptations, but more research is done more research needs to be done in order for us to kind of understand what's happening on this chronic stage, right? So do resting testosterone levels change substantially? Do we have changes in the receptors that are kind of receiving the testosterone? Are receptors kind of upregulated? So again, kind of think of that as like getting more bang for our buck in terms of in terms of what's happening from a chronic perspective. Okay. Growth hormone, again, this is a pretty hot topic in the world of resistance training research, and we're trying to understand the complexities of this as it relates to its binding proteins. Okay, so again, growth hormone is going to interact with these different proteins and cause a building cascade, and so we want to understand what's happening there. So growth hormone is really important as part of our normal development from baby to adulthood, and it also plays an important role in adaptation to stress and resistance training. So again, when we do resistance training or when we do any high intensity exercise, we're breaking down muscle. And so growth hormone is going to help us to build that muscle back up, hopefully a little bit better, a little bit stronger, a little bit bigger than what it was when you started, right? So again, that's kind of the idea with this type of training and how growth hormone is going to play a role here. So there's a positive correlation between growth hormone responses and muscle fiber hypertrophy following 20 weeks of resistance training. Okay, so again, we're seeing that growth hormone is going to become increasingly responsive and allow us to increasingly improve the size of that muscle when we do chronic resistance training. This is just kind of cool. This shows you all the different things that are happening as it relates to growth hormone. So here you can see growth hormone being released from the anterior pituitary, and it's going to work on a feedback loop. Okay, so again, growth hormone is going to have some direct actions like metabolic actions. So it's going to cause an increase in fat breakdown and release so that we are using more fat. It's also going to increase sugar metabolism or carbohydrate metabolism. So again, if I want to grow, I've got to have fuel in order to do so. We're also going to have some other actions on this side, on the left here, these indirect actions that are growth promoting. So we're going to have an effect on the liver and something known as insulin-like growth factor or IGF. And this is going to cause an increase in cartilage and skeletal growth. So again, thinking about the bone structure and creating strong bones that are going to be able to support or hold on to these bigger, stronger muscles. And then what a lot of us are after here is this extra skeletal. So looking at an increase in protein synthesis and growth of the cell within the muscle itself. Okay. Growth hormone responses to stress. So how does growth hormone respond? It's going to respond to a variety of different stressors. Number one, resistance training, high intensity resistance training. Okay, so again, the other thing to note with this is we've got to be consistent with this over time because that endocrine system is a slow response. So we've got to do this, I would say, at least 8 weeks in order for us to start moving that needle a little bit, in order for us to start seeing these changes. Hypoxia is another stressor. So this is like when I don't have enough oxygen. So again, doing something with such high intensity that I have to go anaerobic. And also an increase in hydrogen. And an increase in hydrogen would indicate that I am using anaerobic fuels. And the use of anaerobic fuels or kind of some of that high intensity work is going to cause me to release growth hormone because if I'm doing that high intensity work, it's very likely that I am experiencing some cell damage. What about in women? What are we seeing here? So growth hormone concentrations are highest during the menstrual phase. However, we're not really sure what's going on there, which is kind of interesting. So there's lots of thoughts on this. This is, I think, super interesting when we think about working with elite females. Can we manipulate their training to kind of get the greatest bang for our buck at this particular time in their menstrual cycle or in their menstrual phase in order for us to kind of improve to the greatest extent? Research is still pretty unsure about that because there's so many other factors. What's normal for one female is significantly different, because of the variations in their menstrual hormones, the length of the menstrual cycle, the use of these different birth control mechanisms as well. So again, we can use like an estrogen pill, and that would potentially increase growth hormone. You can use a non-hormonal birth control that wouldn't influence estrogen levels. So again, we're not sure, which is super interesting to kind of think about. Okay, we know this. There's something going on here. We're not exactly sure what this means when we go to apply that to the real world or apply that to our needs for our athletes. Okay, we do know that we got to do high intensity resistance training. Are you seeing a theme here? In order for us to increase this growth hormone response, regardless of menstrual cycle phase. Okay. So the other thing, we said with testosterone, we're going to have this kind of this diurnal response. It's going to be high in the morning, lower at night, high in the morning, lower at night. Growth hormone is going to be released in like a pulsatile fashion. So it's about like every 90 minutes or so, you're going to get a little burst of growth hormone. So it makes it really hard for us to track its changes because it's going to burst and then it's going to like relax and then it's going to burst and it's going to relax. So again, it's really difficult for us to measure that, which is kind of why we're struggling to understand the relationship here in a lot of these different factors. However, we do know that there will be changes in growth receptor sensitivities. We've got some diurnal variations, and we are likely going to see some changes with chronic training. However, we don't know. We don't know exactly what that looks like, but we do know the application. I got to do high intensity resistance training in order for me to get those benefits. So I guess when we think about this as coaches, what's going on behind the scenes, it's nice to know and it's nice to understand. But as long as we know the application, I think that is really the best takeaway that we can have from this. Okay, so insulin, like growth factor, was another hormone that I mentioned. And like the title tells us, it is like growth factor. It's going to stimulate systemic body growth, has growth promoting effects on kind of like all the vital systems or all the vital areas. In particular for us, the cartilage, the bones, the skeletal muscle, and the nerves. Okay, so again, I would say those are kind of some of those critical areas when we think about success from an athletic perspective. It can also help to regulate cell growth and development as well. So this is kind of cool. There's 6 different binding proteins for IGF, or insulin-like growth factor, within the blood, and each binding protein responds to exercise stress independently. So it's got its own, like, there's 6 different things that it can do, and it's kind of, I don't want to say they work independently, but they kind of do work independently when we think about this exercise stressor. Okay, so IGF release is affected by exercise stress. So again, more stress, more release. The adaptation or release of other hormones. So again, these hormones aren't going to work kind of in a silo. They're going to work simultaneously and work together in order for us to improve the quality of that muscle, in order for us to improve the quality of recovery. And then also binding protein availability as well. So we know that exercise can cause an acute increase in IGF, or insulin-like growth factor. And this will occur in the blood, in the interstitial fluid, in the muscle of those locally activated areas. And these increases are going to be more pronounced when resting levels are low. Okay, so stimulation is about 8 to 24 hours following an exercise bout. Again, probably more of a selling point for us then to make sure we're doing this consistently, right? I'm a huge believer in consistent exercise, even on our recovery days. What can I do? What can I do to continue to improve when my opponents are laying on the couch, right? So thinking about, if this stimulation lasts 8 to 24 hours, right, I need to be doing something every day in order to continue to push myself forward. Okay, so at rest, the fat cells produce the majority of the IGF. During acute exercise, the muscle cells will release IGF and have what's called an autocrine effect. So they're going to kind of affect themselves. And again, this kind of goes along with the principle of specificity, right? So again, if I want to have strong arms, I need to do exercises that stimulate my arms. If I want to have a strong core, I need to do exercises that are going to stress and stimulate the muscles of the core. Okay, so again, if you skip leg day, you're not going to have big muscles in your legs. So thinking about that specificity is also true when we think about the hormonal relationship that we see in these systems. So what about training adaptations? So chronic changes in IGF due to resistance training are variant within the research. So again, we know that there is a lot of variation here. Probably some genetic components will play an important role here. And then calorie intake and baseline IGF will also play a huge role. So again, I've got to make sure I'm fueling myself enough in order for my body to support this change or increase in muscle size, muscle growth over time. Okay, so moving on and talking about these adrenal hormones, we've got cortisol and the catecholamines. Catecholamines include epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine. These are awesome. Let's take a look. Okay, cortisol. So you can see cortisol acts as a catabolic hormone. So catabolic hormone means that it's breaking down. And cortisol is going to be released in times of stress. And its job is to signal carbohydrate metabolism. So it's getting things out of storage. So it's getting those sugars out of storage and allowing us to use those. Okay. It can also convert amino acids to carbohydrates. We don't want to do that, but it can if we need to. It also inhibits protein synthesis because we're trying to take care of the stress instead of build things up. It's a time of repair in that regard. You can see there's some diurnal variations here with our concentrations being highest in the mornings for cortisol. Now, cortisol is a good thing. However, we don't want to have chronically high cortisol. Let's take a look. So there is an acute increase in cortisol following exercise. And that's because if we do some muscle damage, we're going to have inflammation in there. So that's good. We want to have cortisol released when we do exercise. However, we've got to completely recover before we're ready for another hard stressor. Okay, so again, we want that cortisol there. We want to have that inflammation, the tissue remodeling. We want that tissue to be repaired. Then we want those cortisol levels to drop so that we're ready to do something harder. Okay, so chronic levels are bad, but acute increases are probably part of a larger remodeling process that's going to help us to repair that muscle tissue. Okay, catecholamines. Um, research shows that those who have higher catecholamine release were able to maintain higher force output during exercise. So epinephrine and also norepinephrine and dopamine, but mostly epinephrine, is a central motor stimuli. Okay, so it's going to activate that central nervous system, peripheral vascular dilator. So we're able to send more blood flow to the muscle. We're enhancing enzymatic activity, which is going to allow reactions to occur faster, and we're inducing calcium release in the muscle, which allows us to produce greater force when we are stimulating that muscle. Catecholamines are awesome. They do all sorts of good things to allow us to improve that exercise performance while we're in that moment. So they can increase force production. They're going to improve the metabolic enzymatic activity. So again, allowing us to have these processes occurring faster, increase muscle contraction rate. So again, creating quicker, more forceful contractions. They're going to increase blood pressure and blood flow, which is going to allow us to send blood and oxygen and nutrients to the muscles that we need. And also it's going to help us to get energy ready so that we're ready to roll and we can continue doing this. In terms of overuse, we'll see adrenal responses decrease and hence a decrease in catecholamine release. So again, we want to release this during exercise and really no other time though. Okay, so we've got to back it off so that we're not being overtrained. So what about training adaptations? So catecholamines are probably the first endocrine mechanism response in resistance training. So when I start that warm up, I'm going to start having that catecholamine release, and it's going to kind of build based on the intensity. Threshold for catecholamine release increases with training status. So again, the more fit I am, the more I have to do in order to activate this hormone in order for us to kind of get this system rolling. Training protocols should be varied to allow the adrenal glands to engage in recovery. So again, we want to have these hard stressors, then we need to have easy days in order for us to truly recover, both with cortisol and catecholamines. So again, when we think about the relationship between the endocrine system and resistance training, we know that these things are very closely linked. And so we think about working with our athletes, what's the greatest response that we can receive or elicit as it relates to resistance training and hormones, right? So essentially the biggest takeaway here is we got to do high intensity workouts with low rest, give ourselves a great amount of stress, and then back it off for recovery. Okay. And again, this just kind of gives you some ideas about how we might be able to optimize that. But again, I would stress that high intensity workouts consistently, week after week, month after month, year after year, is the best way for us to start to see adaptations within the system. All right, that is it for today. I hope you have a great day, and please reach out if you do have any questions about this.